Welcome once again to this online course on responding to climate risks in agriculture and natural resource management. We're still covering Module 3, the Introduction on Vulnerability Assessment. For this lecture, we're going to focus on the second part of the assessment process of climate change vulnerability assessment. In the previous lecture, we discussed steps 1 to 3. We'll begin now from step 4 in this particular lecture, which is on the assessment of sensitivity to climate change. The purpose of this step is to identify areas that will be likely affected by climate change, and this is on the basis of their sensitivity. If you can recall, sensitivity of an area or of a person to climate change is its responsiveness to the climate stimuli, be it extreme climate events or simply increases in temperature or changes in precipitation. The output of this step are maps of sensitive areas, such as, for instance, crop production areas that will be easily affected by climate change, or communities living in steep slopes or along rivers and coastal areas. The data that we need for this particular step are topographic maps and other maps, such as land use and land cover maps and settlement areas maps and so on. The methods that we can use for generating this information include the review of past records or related documents, focus group discussions, and GIS analysis will be very useful in this particular steps, as we will determine the people in the places that will be sensitive based on certain parameters, such as their location and also the type of system that are involved. This is an example of a matrix showing different land cover and different topographic conditions, such as those areas greater than 30% here represent areas that are more sensitive to rain-induced landslides compared to areas that are much gentler in slope. And so these areas were generated during using geographic information system, isolating those areas with slopes steeper than 30%, considered to be more sensitive to rain-induced landslides and accelerated erosion processes. Step number 5 is on the assessment of adaptive capacity. The main purpose of this step is to assess the past responses to climate-related hazards, which will form basis for identifying potential adaptation strategies to cope with future climate, and the assessment of key indicators of adaptive capacity, such as Human Development Index, population density, road density, social networks, even indigenous knowledge systems. The main output of this step are adaptive capacity maps. The data that we will need for this particular step include information on past responses to climate-related hazards, Human Development Index, population density, road density map, social networks, indigenous knowledge systems. This information can be generated using historical records, review of documents, focus group discussion and workshops, key informant interview, and again, GIS analysis will be very useful in mapping out the adaptive capacity of different areas, different groups of stakeholders that are exposed to climate change. Here is an example of a GIS process where Human Development Index represented on a map was overlaid using GIS to produce adaptive capacity map, which are then can be used for the eventual rating of the vulnerability of the different areas covered in the map. Here is an example of an adaptive capacity map. This is for Lake Lanao Basin in southern Philippines. This was generated by overlaying three different kinds of thematic maps, namely Human Development Index, population density, and accessibility or proximity to road networks. The darker colored areas represent areas of high adaptive capacity, while the lightly colored areas, these are the areas that are supposed to have low adaptive capacity, meaning to say they are expected to adapt, not to adapt as well as those areas with high adaptive capacity, which are coded in dark colors. Here is an example of a survey of general adaptation strategies implemented by residents of Pantabangan watershed, which is a big watershed in central Luzon, Philippines. And this was generated through household interviews. And here you can see a list of different strategies that were used by the households in the watershed, and from the different towns that are found inside the watershed areas. Again, here is another example of past responses to extreme climate events. This time, this is in Upper Bukidnon River Basin in southern Philippines. And again, this was generated through a participatory workshop involving the communities, local government units, farmers, and even representatives of national government agencies in that particular river basin. And here are the list of the different responses to past climate-related events, including flash floods, including landslides and droughts in the river basin. Step number 6 is on vulnerability rating. The purpose of this step is to assess the degree of vulnerability of peoples, places, resources. If you recall in the previous steps, what we have identified are people who are actually exposed to certain climate risks, and people who are supposed to have varying adaptive capacity. And therefore, on those bases, we know that while a whole area can be exposed to the same climate risks and hazards, the impact on the different sectors or different groups of people in the area will vary just because their adaptive capacity also varies. And therefore, in this particular step, we try to rate the vulnerability of these different groups of people with varying adaptive capacities as they are exposed to climate risks. And the main output of this step are vulnerability maps showing which areas are more vulnerable than others, which communities are more vulnerable than others, which resources are more vulnerable than others. The data that we need for this step includes results from the previous steps. In other words, this is just a carryover of what the other steps are producing in terms of information. The methods that will be useful for this particular step, again, is the geographic information and participatory workshops. This is an example of a vulnerability map which was produced through participatory workshop. And here you can see areas which are coded with different colors and different shapes that are actually representative of different stakeholders with different stakeholders, and also showing the vulnerability of the areas. In this particular map, those areas where you can see a triangular object,
The red triangle.